July 29th, 1030. The damp earth of the Norwegian valley of Verdal, cut by the silver thread of its namesake river, was soaked in blood. The air, thick and humid after a recent rain, heavy with the scent of wet grass, sweat, and iron, rang with a cacophony of death, the high, clear clang of swords on helmets, the dull, sickening thud of axes on wooden shields and flesh, the hoarse, guttural cries of attackers, and the ragged, gurgling moans of the dying. Here at the farmstead of Stiklestad, in the very heart of Norway, not just the fate of a throne was being decided. The very soul of this land was at stake. King Olaf the Saint, later known as the Saint, was trying to reclaim his kingdom, taken by the mighty Knut the Great, Lord of Denmark, England, and now Norway. But this was not simply a battle of an exiled king against a usurper. This was a civil war. Against Olaf's handful of loyal warriors and the Swedish mercenaries who had come with him from Gardariki stood a huge, motley army of Norwegian bondir, or free landowners. They were led into battle by the nobility, the very same powerful chieftains and jarls whom Olaf had tried to crush and bend to his will. For them, this was a battle not for a Danish king, but against their own. They feared his relentless centralization of power, which stripped them of their ancient freedoms and the right to self-government through their local things. They were irritated by the new, alien Christian faith that Olaf was imposing with fire, sword, and executions, destroying their ancient pagan shrines and forcing them to forget the names of Odin and Thor. This was a rebellion of the old pagan and freedom-loving Norway against the new Christian and feudal one. In the very thick of this carnage, amidst axes glinting in the rare sun and arrows whistling overhead, fought a 15-year-old youth, tall for his age, with broad bones and light, almost white hair matted with sweat and blood. He fought with the desperate fury known only to those with nothing to lose. His name was Harald, and he was the uterine brother of King Olaf. For him, this was his first real battle. He saw their thin line waver under the crushing onslaught of superior forces. He heard the enemy's war horn roar like a mythical beast, heralding their doom. And he saw his brother fall. 3 blows etched into his memory forever. An axe blow to the left knee, forcing the king to lean against a stone, then a spear thrust into his abdomen under the unprotected side of his mail coat, and finally the mortal, crushing blow of an axe to the neck, ending the life and reign of Olaf Haraldsson. It was at this moment, as the sun, according to legends, hid behind clouds in an unnatural eclipse, plunging the battlefield into an ominous twilight that contemporaries took for the wrath of God or sorcery, that young Harald's fate took its first sharp turn. Severely wounded in the thigh, bleeding profusely and nearly unconscious, he was carried from the battlefield by a loyal comrade of his father, Ragnvald Brusason, and hidden deep in the forest in the hut of a solitary peasant. The old world had collapsed. The king was dead, his army annihilated, and Norway was definitively under Danish rule. For a 15-year-old prince without a kingdom, without an army, and without a future, only one path remained: the path of an exile, the path of a shadow pursued by enemies. No one could have imagined then that this wounded youth, tossing feverishly on a straw pallet in a forest hut, would not just survive. He would pass through fire and sword across half the world, from the icy rivers of Gardariki to the scorching deserts of Syria and holy Jerusalem. He would become the most celebrated and highly paid warrior of his time, captain of the legendary Varangian Guard in glittering Constantinople. He would amass untold treasures about which sagas would be composed and which no Scandinavian king had ever dreamed of. He would return to his homeland not as a begging exile, but as a formidable conqueror, to take by force what he considered his by right of birth. His name, Harald Sigurdsson, nicknamed by posterity Hardrada, or the Hard Ruler, would become synonymous with indomitable will, ruthless ambition, and the very essence of the fading Viking age. This is the story of the last great Viking, whose life was one continuous battle, and whose death marked the end of an entire era. It seemed as if the mists that perpetually clung to the slopes of the Norwegian fjords concealed not only the rocks but the very soul of this land. Wild, untamable, and fragmented. The great achievement of Harald Fairhair, who first united these warring lands into a single kingdom after the Battle of Hafrsfjord, was already more than a century in the past, but his legacy was cracking at the seams. In this world where loyalty to one's clan was stronger than loyalty to the crown, and the edge of an axe weighed more than any law, a boy was to be born who was destined to become the quintessence of all the contradictions of his era. Before the thread of fate cast Harald into distant lands, he was flesh and blood of the harsh and unsettled world of early 11th century Norway. This land was a patchwork of petty kingdoms, or smokonger, as they were called, and the domains of powerful jarls only recently and with great difficulty united under the rule of a single monarch. However, this unity was as fragile as the first ice on a fjord. The king's authority was constantly challenged by the clan-based nobility, the mighty chieftains, Hofdingjar, and the free landowners, bondir, who gathered at local things, that is, popular assemblies, to administer justice and decide their own affairs, and who viewed any attempt at centralization with the deepest suspicion. For them, accustomed to almost complete autonomy, the king was more a first among equals, a military leader, than an absolute monarch in the feudal sense. Any attempt to introduce uniform taxes or laws that infringed on their rights was perceived as tyranny. Harald was born around the year 1015 in Ringerike, a small but strategically important kingdom in eastern Norway. His father was the local king Sigurd Syr, or Sigurd the Sow as he was known in Old Norse. The nickname was probably not insulting but indicated his main occupation, for he was a man of business, a sturdy master who was deeply involved in managing his lands, breeding livestock, and farming. In an era when the highest valor was seen in raiding expeditions, Sigurd was an exception. He was a descendant of Harald Fairhair himself, but preferred to increase his wealth through peaceful labor rather than risky military adventures. The sagas describe him as a prudent, wise, and even modest man. Harald's mother, Åsta Gudbrandsdottir, was quite different. This woman possessed a strong, imperious character and was the living link connecting their family to the main line of the struggle for the Norwegian throne. Her first husband was Harald Grenske, a king of Vestfold, who was treacherously murdered by order of the Swedish queen Sigrid the Haughty for his persistent marriage proposals. From this tragic marriage, Åsta had a son, Olaf, the future king of Norway, who was destined to become one of the most iconic and controversial figures in Scandinavian history. Thus, Harald Sigurdsson was Olaf's younger half-brother on his mother's side, and this kinship, this shadow of his great brother, would haunt and guide him throughout his life. Harald's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of constant political intrigue and military clashes. He saw his older brother Olaf, having returned from long travels and campaigns where he had served as a mercenary in England and Normandy, begin a brutal and bloody struggle to unite Norway under his rule and to Christianize it. It was an era of tectonic shift. The ancient pagan beliefs, a complex and multifaceted world where Odin was the god of war and wisdom, Thor the protector of men, and Freyr the god of fertility, were giving way to a new, monotheistic religion, Christianity. But this change was happening not through preaching, but through violence. For a Norwegian bondi, renouncing the old gods was not just a change of rituals. It was a rejection of ancestors, of the guardian spirits of the land on which he lived, of the very order of the world where fate, or word, was intertwined with the will of the gods of Asgard. The sacred groves where sacrifices were made were centers of social life. Christianity, on the other hand, demanded a complete break with this world, offering in its place one jealous god and an alien hierarchical power structure in the form of bishops, subordinate to distant foreign archbishops. Therefore Olaf, nicknamed the Saint after his death, for his zeal in imposing the faith, acted with fire and sword. He destroyed pagan shrines, forcibly baptized the nobility, and those who resisted he executed, maimed, or exiled, confiscating their lands. Such a policy provoked fierce resistance. The powerful Jarls of Lade, the longtime rulers of the north, and the freedom-loving Bondir, saw in Olaf's actions not only religious fanaticism but also a direct assault on their ancestral rights, traditions, and freedoms. For them, he was a tyrant who had violated the ancient order. It was this discontent that allowed the Danish king Knut the Great, creator of a vast North Sea empire that included England and Denmark, to easily take Norway from Olaf in 1028. Knut was a brilliant politician. He did not just conquer, he won people over. He generously gifted the Norwegian nobility with gold and promises to preserve their freedoms, while Olaf offered them only submission and a new faith. As a result, when Knut's fleet entered the Norwegian fjords, Olaf found himself almost without support and was forced to flee to Rus. Harald grew up watching this. Unlike his industrious father, he displayed a wild, untamable, and warlike nature from childhood. A saga says that he matured early and was very strong. He was taller, stronger, and more handsome than his peers, but most importantly, an unquenchable fire of ambition burned within him. He did not want to count pigs and measure harvests like his father. He dreamed of the glory, booty, and power about which the skalds sang in the feasting halls, accompanying themselves on the harp or talharpa. His heroes were not peaceful kings, but the great Vikings of the past, Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Eric Bloodaxe, whose dragon ships had terrorized all of Europe from Ireland to Italy. The world in which he lived was simple and brutal. The main virtues were bravery in battle, loyalty to one's chieftain, and generosity to the warband. Conflicts were resolved by force of arms, and blood feud was not just a right but a sacred duty that could span generations. Life was spent in long wooden houses without windows, where a hearth burned in the center, and the smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, mingling with the smell of people, livestock, and cooking food. People ate what the land and sea gave them: salted cod, smoked salmon, meat, porridge of rye and barley, washing it all down with beer or mead. They were excellent seafarers and shipbuilders. Their drakkar ships, long, narrow, and fast vessels with fearsome carved dragon heads on the prow, which were removed when approaching home shores so as not to anger the land's guardian spirits, were the pinnacle of engineering thought at the time. It was in this environment that Harald's character was formed. He learned to wield a sword and axe before he firmly grasped Christian prayers. He listened to sagas of campaigns and battles, and his heart thrilled with the desire to repeat the feats of ancient heroes. When his brother Olaf, exiled by a coalition of Norwegian nobility and the Danish king Knut the Great, returned from Gardariki to reclaim his throne, Harald, despite his mother's pleas and his young age, unhesitatingly gathered his own detachment and joined his ranks. For him, the Battle of Stiklestad was not just the defense of his brother. It was his first chance to prove himself, to announce himself to the world. And although this battle ended in catastrophe and exile, it became for Harald the crucible that forged the young prince into a hardened warrior, ready for a long and dangerous journey to the heights of power. He learned the main lesson of that day. Courage and claims to the throne are not enough. One needs strength, cunning, and luck. A shattered army, a dead king, a lost homeland. For many, this would have been the end, an inglorious conclusion to their journey. But for the 15-year-old Harald, it was merely a cruel beginning. Fate, having closed the doors of Norway to him, opened others in the east. There, beyond the dense forests and wide rivers, lay a land that his countrymen called the Land of Cities, or Gardariki, and it was ruled by a prince whose wisdom was as great as his domains and whose daughter would become a guiding star for the exile. And while the map of power in Scandinavia was being redrawn, and the Danish raven banner flew over the Norwegian fjords, the wounded Harald, having miraculously escaped death, began his long journey east. After his wounds had somewhat healed under the care of a peasant hermit, he could no longer remain in Norway. He was the brother of the deposed king, the son of an influential kinglet, and thus a tempting prize for the supporters of Knut the Great, who sought to eradicate the line of Olaf the Saint. He spent the winter hiding in the mountains, and in the spring secretly made his way to Sweden, where King Anund Jacob, who was Olaf's cousin and had supported him in the fight against the Danes, ruled. Here, in the forests and secluded manors, he began to gather around him the remnants of the defeated army. Exiles like himself, who had lost everything but the weapons in their hands, and the thirst for revenge in their hearts. But Sweden was only a temporary refuge. For an ambitious youth dreaming of glory and wealth, there was only one path, one that had beckoned northerners for centuries, the legendary Ostervägar, the way east to Gardariki, as the Scandinavians called Kievan Rus. And so, in 1031, having gathered a detachment of about 500 desperate warriors, Harald Sigurdsson arrived in Kiev, at the court of the Grand Prince Yaroslav, whom the sagas called Yaroslav the Wise. This move was not just an escape, but a strategic one. Kievan Rus at that time was a powerful and prosperous state, sprawling over vast territories from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Its wealth was built on control over the great trade routes, primarily the artery from the Varangians to the Greeks, which connected cold Scandinavia with the richest empire in the world, Byzantium. Kiev, the mother of Rus's cities, amazed the northerners. It was a huge city for its time, surrounded by powerful earthen ramparts and wooden walls with towers. Inside, life was bustling. Merchants from all over the world flocked to the lively piers of the Podil district, Scandinavians, Greeks, Arabs, Germans, Armenians. Here, furs, wax, and honey from the north were sold, as were spices, silks, and jewels from the east, and wine, weapons, and luxury goods from Byzantium. The prince's court of Yaroslav, located in the upper city, was the center of political, cultural, and military life. Yaroslav the Wise himself was one of the most educated and far-sighted rulers in Europe. He not only expanded and strengthened his state, but also built stone churches and monasteries, including the future St. Sophia Cathedral, founded schools, collected and translated books, and created the first code of laws, the Ruskaya Pravda. His court was open to warriors and scholars from other countries, and he highly valued the fighting qualities of the Varangians. Yaroslav welcomed Harald and his men warmly. His own wife, Ingigerd, was the daughter of a Swedish king, and he understood the mentality and value of Scandinavian warriors perfectly. Moreover, Yaroslav himself had been through a bloody feud with his brothers, especially with Sviatopolk the Accursed, and knew well the importance of loyal swords not connected with local boyar clans. For the Kievan prince, experienced and ruthless mercenaries were a most valuable resource. Rus was constantly at war on its borders, with the Pecheneg nomads in the south, whose sudden raids threatened Kiev itself, with the Poles in the west who contested the Cherven towns, and with the Lithuanian and Yotvingian tribes in the northwest. The Varangian retinues serving the Kievan princes constituted the elite of their army, their special forces which were thrown into the most decisive moments. The years spent in Rus, from 1031 to 1034, became a magnificent military school for Harald. He did not just sit idle in Kiev. The sagas report that he, along with another noble Varangian, Eilif Rognvaldsson, led Yaroslav's troops in a successful campaign in 1031 against the Poles, which resulted in the recapture of the Cherven towns. He participated in brutal clashes with the Pechenegs in the southern steppes, studying the tactics of light cavalry and methods of combating it. In these campaigns, he honed his tactical skills, learned to command large mixed detachments consisting not only of Varangians but also of Slavic militiamen. He quickly gained respect at the princely court, becoming one of Yaroslav's trusted military commanders. But it was not only war that occupied the young Viking's thoughts. At Yaroslav's court, he met the one who would capture his heart for many years, the prince's eldest daughter, the beautiful Elisiv, whom the Scandinavian sagas called Elisiv. She was a true princess, having received an excellent education unlike the illiterate Valkyries of his homeland. For a landless exile, even of royal blood but without a kingdom or crown, marriage to the daughter of a powerful ruler was an impossible dream. Yaroslav, who conducted a subtle dynastic policy and married his daughters to the kings of France, Hungary, and Norway, made it clear to Harald, military valor alone was not enough. To ask for Elisiv's hand, he needed to acquire something more. Fame that would resound throughout the world, and no less importantly, immense wealth, comparable to a royal daughter's dowry. This refusal, which would have broken another man, only fueled Harald's ambitions to the limit. He realized that Gardariki, which had given him refuge and invaluable combat experience, could not be the pinnacle of his journey. His gaze turned further south, to where the great Dnieper path led, to the fabulous Tsargrad, or Miklagard, meaning the great city, as the Vikings called it. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was the center of the world, a city of unimaginable wealth, unparalleled luxury, and boundless opportunities. There, in the service of the Byzantine emperor, one could find both glory and gold in quantities that northern rulers could not even dream of. And Harald made his decision. He would leave Yaroslav's service to go to the very heart of civilization and return from there a man worthy of the princess's hand. All the gold he would acquire he would send for safekeeping to Kiev, to Yaroslav the Wise as a pledge of his return and his intentions. It was a daring gamble, but Harald had never been afraid to take risks. If Gardariki was a military academy for Harald, the next stage of his journey was to be his final exam, and at the same time a gold mine. The Dnieper River carried his dragon ships south, to the Black Sea, which the Greeks called the Euxine Pontus. Ahead lay Miklagard, Constantinople, the city built by the first Christian emperor at the crossroads of two continents. A beacon of civilization in a dark sea of barbarism, the dream and goal of any northern warrior seeking glory and wealth. Harald was going there for gold and fame, but he did not yet know that he would find there a world of sophisticated intrigues, bloody palace coups, and dangers surpassing anything he had faced before. In 1034, Harald Sigurdsson and his detachment of about 500 battle-hardened warriors arrived in Constantinople. The journey along this legendary route was in itself an epic adventure. The ships had to overcome the formidable Dnieper Rapids, 9 rocky ridges that blocked the river. At each rapid, which had its own Slavic and Scandinavian name, they had to drag their longships ashore and haul them over slippery stones, while lookouts kept a keen eye on the steppe, from where the Pechenegs could attack at any moment. Having passed the rapids, they entered the open sea, navigating by the stars and the coastline, until on the horizon rose the legendary walls of the greatest city in the Christian world. What met their eyes surpassed all the wildest tales of the Skalds. Constantinople was not just a city, it was an entire universe. Huge, sprawling over 7 hills on the shores of the Bosphorus, it was protected by a triple ring of impregnable Theodosian walls, which seemed the work of giants. Above the city of 1,000,000 people rose the giant floating dome of Hagia Sophia, glittering in the sun so brightly it blinded the eyes. The streets were paved with stone and lit at night, unlike the muddy roads of northern cities. There were multi-story apartment buildings, insulae, aqueducts that brought clean water to the city, underground cisterns, and the grand hippodrome, where chariot races were held, gathering tens of thousands of spectators divided into the blue and green factions. In luxurious palaces, emperors lived in unimaginable luxury, surrounded by a complex and lavish ceremonial that was meant to emphasize their divine status. For the Vikings, accustomed to the harsh simplicity of their longhouses, this city seemed magical. But they had not come here to admire the architecture. They had come to serve and to earn, and the best place for that was the famous Varangian Guard, in Greek, tagmaton varangon, an elite unit of mercenaries who served as the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor. The Varangian Guard was a unique phenomenon. Formed at the end of the 10th century by Emperor Basil II and from 6,000 Rus warriors sent to him by the Kievan Prince Vladimir, it quickly established itself as the most combat-effective and, paradoxically, the most loyal unit in the ever-intriguing Byzantine army. This loyalty, however, had a simple explanation. The Varangians served not some political faction, but the emperor personally, the basileus, who paid them a huge salary in gold. They were outsiders in this world of palace conspiracies. Their loyalty could be bought, and the emperors paid generously for it. Their armament was formidable. Besides traditional Scandinavian swords and round shields, their distinctive mark was huge two-handed axes with a wide blade, or pelekiphoroi, the mere sight of which terrified their enemies. Their reputation was impeccable. They were famous for their ferocity in battle, unshakable steadfastness, and absolute ruthlessness. Harald and his men were immediately accepted into the ranks of the Guard. At that time, the empire was ruled by Michael IV the Paphlagonian, a former money changer who had ascended the throne thanks to the love of the powerful Empress Zoe. The empire, despite its outward grandeur, was constantly at war on all its borders, and experienced warriors were needed like air. Harald very quickly distinguished himself. He was not lost among thousands of other mercenaries. His tall stature, physical strength, tactical acumen, command experience gained in ruses, and an innate ability to lead men did not go unnoticed. He was not afraid of the dirtiest and most dangerous work. In the period from 1034 to 1036, he, at the head of his detachment, participated in campaigns to clear the coast of Asia Minor and the Aegean Sea of Arab pirates who plundered merchant ships and raided coastal towns. In these naval battles, which required speed, onslaught, and skill in boarding combat, Harald and his Vikings felt like fish in water. They mercilessly slaughtered pirate crews, burned their base, and returned to Constantinople with rich booty, strengthening their reputation and increasing their wealth. Even then, Harald displayed traits that would become his hallmark. He was not only a brave warrior, but also an incredibly cunning and resourceful commander. The sagas are full of stories about his military stratagems. One of them tells how he took a well-fortified city in Sicily by ordering his men to catch birds that nested in the city and flew out to the fields for food during the day. Smoldering tinder soaked in sulfur and wax was tied to the birds' legs, and when the birds returned to their nests under the thatched and tiled roofs, a terrible fire broke out in the city. In panic, the inhabitants surrendered the city without a fight. In another case, facing an impregnable fortress, Harald pretended to be mortally ill. Soon a rumor reached the besieged that the Varangian leader had died. His warriors, with weeping and wailing, asked the townspeople for permission to bury their chieftain according to Christian custom inside the city walls, in the local church. When the funeral procession with the coffin entered the city, the dead Harald suddenly resurrected, and his warriors who followed the coffin drew their sword hidden under their cloaks and seized the gates. These stories, though embellished by the skalds, reflect the essence of his tactics, a combination of brute force and sophisticated cunning. He quickly rose through the ranks, earning the respect not only of his countrymen, but also of the Byzantine command. Soon his name became known throughout the empire. The exiled Norwegian prince was becoming one of the most famous and highly paid commanders in the service of the Roman emperors. And this was only the beginning of his Byzantine odyssey, which would lead him to the battlefields from Sicily to Jerusalem. Constantinople paid generously, but it also demanded much. A Varangian's loyalty was measured by the blood he shed, whether enemies or his own. Harald was to prove his worth in the most dangerous theaters of the empire's wars. First, on the sun-scorched island of Sicily, where the pearl of the Mediterranean had to be wrested from the hands of the Saracens, and then in the Balkans, where the smoldering embers of Bulgarian separatism had once again flared up into a fierce flame of rebellion. These campaigns would cover his name with glory and his coffers with gold, but they would also draw him into the deadly whirlpool of Byzantine politics. Harald's star as a Byzantine commander truly rose during the two largest military campaigns of that period. In 1038, Byzantium began a large-scale operation to reconquer Sicily from the Arabs, who had held the island for over 2 centuries. The expeditionary force was led by one of the empire's best commanders, George Meniakes, a man of immense stature and equally immense ambitions. It was a motley army, which, in addition to Greek regiments, included Lombard mercenaries, Normans from southern Italy under the future famous adventurer William Ironarm, and of course the elite of the army, the Varangian Guard led by Harald Sigurdsson. The campaign in Sicily was a real test for Harald. The fighting took place in an unfamiliar hot climate, against a stubborn and skilled enemy, but it was here that his talents were fully revealed. The Varangians were the vanguard of the Byzantine army. They were thrown into the most dangerous sectors. They stormed fortified cities like Messina and Syracuse, and in every battle, Harald was at the forefront, inspiring his men by personal example. The sagas describe him as a helmet smasher, a warrior who burst into enemy ranks, sowing death and panic. However, Harald's relations with the commander, George Meniakes, were not good. Meniakes was a talented but extremely arrogant and hot-tempered man. There was constant friction between him and the independent, proud Scandinavian who brooked no slight, especially when it came to dividing the spoils of war. Harald believed that his Varangians, who bore the brunt of the fighting, deserved a larger share, and he was not shy about arguing with the commander. This conflict almost cost him his career, but ironically, it was the downfall of Meniakes, who, after being recalled to Constantinople on a false denunciation, rebelled against the emperor, that saved Harald. Since he was known for his disagreements with the rebellious general, he was not touched by the imperial disfavor. After the Sicilian campaign, which, despite initial successes, ultimately ended in failure for Byzantium due to internal strife, Harald and his Varangians were urgently transferred to another no less important front. In 1041, a large-scale rebellion of the Bulgarians broke out in the Balkans under the leadership of Peter Delian, who declared himself the grandson of the great Tsar Samuel. The rebellion quickly spread over vast territories, and there was a real threat of the entire Bulgarian kingdom, so hard won by Emperor Basil II the Bulgar Slayer, breaking away. In the decisive Battle of Ostrovo, the Byzantine army, which again featured the brilliant Varangian Guard, clashed with the Bulgarian army. And again, Harald was at the center of events. According to the Scandinavian sagas and some Bulgarian sources, it was he who personally slew Peter Delian in the heat of battle. Deprived of their leader, the Bulgarian army wavered and fled, The rebellion was brutally suppressed, and the Balkans were once again firmly under the rule of Constantinople. The sagas claim that in honor of this victory, Harald's skalds composed a praise poem describing how the mighty king in battle slew the Bulgarian leader. After this victory, Harald's fame reached its zenith. He was showered with favors, received the high court title of Spatharokandidatos, which literally means candidate for the bodyguard, and according to some sources became the Akoluthos, the official commander of the entire Varangian Guard. His wealth became truly legendary. The Varangians received not only a salary but also the right to a share of the war booty, as well as the so-called Polutas Varf, the right to plunder the imperial palace treasury after the death or overthrow of a basileus. Harald, as the leader, received the lion's share. Gold, precious stones, expensive fabrics, weapons, all flowed into his hands, and he, remembering his main goal, methodically sent these treasures to Rus, to Yaroslav. Snorri Sturluson, the 13th century Icelandic historian, wrote that Harald amassed such wealth as no one in the northern lands had ever seen in the possession of one man. In addition to wars, Harald apparently also made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which was common for Christians serving in Byzantium. He cleared the way for pilgrims from robbers and prayed at the Holy Sepulchre. This enterprise not only added to his prestige as a pious Christian, but was also undoubtedly extremely profitable as he provided protection for wealthy pilgrim caravans. However, the higher he rose, the more dangerous his position became. He was an outsider who had achieved incredible success which could not but arouse envy and suspicion among the Byzantine nobility. The palace air of Constantinople was steeped in the poison of intrigue. After the death of Michael IV, his nephew Michael V Caliphates, or the Calker, ascended the throne and tried to remove the powerful Empress Zoe, his adoptive mother, from power. But Michael V miscalculated. The people of Constantinople adored Zoe and her sister Theodora. A rebellion broke out in the city. Michael was overthrown, blinded, and exiled to a monastery. The saga claims that it was Harald who personally led the operation to capture and blind the deposed emperor, which is probably a poetic exaggeration but reflects his important role in these events. It seemed he was once again on the winning side. But his position had become precarious. The new rulers, or rather empresses, the sisters Zoe and Theodora, and then Zoe's new husband, Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos, looked upon the powerful and fabulously wealthy Varangian chieftain with suspicion. There were rumors that he had concealed part of the imperial treasury after the overthrow of Michael V. Moreover, his long-standing enmity with certain court factions came back to haunt him. In the end, Harald was accused of embezzlement and thrown into a dungeon. For many, this would have been the end, but not for Harald Sigurdsson. His Byzantine epic ended as spectacularly as it had begun. According to one version, he was helped to escape by a noble lady named Maria, a niece of Empress Zoe, who was in love with the handsome Varangian. According to another, more plausible version, his loyal guardsmen helped him. Together with several comrades, he made a daring escape from prison, seized a ship in the Golden Horn harbor, and, according to legend, ordered his men to row with all their might towards the huge iron chain that blocked the exit from the bay. Just before the collision, he ordered everyone to run to the stern. The ship's bow lifted and slipped over the chain. Then everyone ran to the bow, and the stern, freed from the weight, also passed the obstacle. Breaking out into the open sea, Harald headed for the Black Sea. His path lay back to Rus, to Kiev. He was not leaving Byzantium empty-handed. He was taking with him the glory of the greatest warrior, invaluable combat and political experience, and according to rumors, the very same Maria whom he would later release after receiving a ransom. 10 years of service in Miklagard had come to an end. A new, most important stage of his life was beginning, the struggle for the crown of Norway. Kiev greeted Harald not as a fugitive but as a triumphant hero. 10 years ago he had left as an ambitious but poor exile. Now he returned a living legend, shrouded in the glory of southern wars with a caravan laden with Byzantine gold. He had returned for his bride, but in his mind was another, harsher and colder bride, the crown of Norway. However, on his path stood his own nephew, the young and popular King Magnus. Fate was preparing a meeting for them that would decide whether blood would be shed once more in the Norwegian fjords. In the winter of 1043 to 1044, Harald Sigurdsson triumphantly returned to Kiev. Yaroslav the Wise had kept his word and had safeguarded all the treasures that Harald had sent from Constantinople. Now that the exile had returned, a man of immense wealth and great fame, nothing stood in the way of his marriage to Elisiv. The lavish wedding of the celebrated Varangian and the Rus's princess sealed their union. Harald's skalds immediately composed visur, or praise poems celebrating the beauty of Elisiv and the valor of her groom. But the feasts and family life in Kiev could not hold the indomitable Harald for long. His main goal remained the same, the crown of Norway. During his absence, the political situation in Scandinavia had changed radically. Danish rule in Norway had proved short-lived. The Norwegian nobility, dissatisfied with the rule of Knut the Great's viceroys, had in 1035 called to the throne Magnus, the young son of the fallen at Stiklestad Olaf the Saint. Thus, Harald's own nephew had become king of Norway. Moreover, after the death of Knut's heirs, Magnus, nicknamed the Good for his justice and peacefulness, had also inherited the crown of Denmark, uniting both kingdoms under his rule. In 1045, Harald, having secured the support and probably the funds of his father-in-law, Yaroslav, departed from Rus. He arrived in Sweden, where he concluded a military alliance with the local king, Anund, and more importantly with Magnus's sworn enemy, the claimant to the Danish throne, Sweyn Estridsson. This alliance posed a mortal threat to Magnus's power. Harald, possessing a vast fortune, immediately began to mint his own coins from Byzantine gold, thereby demonstrating his royal ambitions and financial might. He began to raise an army, and his formidable name attracted numerous adventurers and those dissatisfied with Magnus's rule to his banner. Magnus the Good found himself in a most difficult position. A war on two fronts, against Denmark supported by Sweyn and against his own uncle, one of Europe's best commanders, would have been ruinous for him. And so Magnus's advisors proposed a wise solution: to compromise. Instead of fighting Harald, it was better to make him an ally and co-ruler. In 1046, a meeting between uncle and nephew took place at the mouth of the Göta Elf River. The negotiations were tense. The sagas describe how their ships stood side by side, and both leaders, surrounded by their best warriors, sized each other up. In the end, an agreement was reached. Harald would break his alliance with Sweyn Estridsson and become Magnus's co-ruler in Norway. In return, he agreed to share his vast fortune with Magnus, whose treasury had been depleted by constant wars. Legend has it that Harald ordered his men to bring a bull's hide onto the deck and to pile such a mountain of gold on it that it nearly sank. Thus, a dual monarchy was established in Norway. However, this alliance was doomed from the start. Harald, accustomed to the absolute authority of the Basileus in Byzantium and having been an absolute commander to his mercenaries, could not tolerate even a shadow of equality. He saw Magnus not as an equal king, but as a young, inexperienced nephew who had simply been lucky enough to inherit a throne, for which Harald himself had shed blood in exile. The sagas are full of stories illustrating this hidden contempt and constant rivalry. Once, when their fleets were anchored side by side, the impatient Harald ordered his anchor to be dropped in such a way that it cut the rope of Magnus's precious gilded anchor, sending it to the bottom. To his nephew's outrage, He coolly replied that there were still plenty of anchors in the sea, and that his wealth was enough to compensate for any loss. This act was not mere carelessness, it was a demonstration of power. Harald was showing that his will and his pragmatism were above any sentimental values, even those belonging to a king. The joint rule of two such different men could not be smooth. Magnus was a pious, peace-loving, and compromise-prone ruler, for which he earned the nickname the Good. Harald was his complete opposite, harsh, imperious, ruthless, sarcastic, and accustomed to solving all problems by force. The entire year of their joint rule was spent in hidden confrontation. The sagas are full of episodes describing their constant disputes and conflicts over every issue, from the seating of their retinues at feasts to matters of state importance. The resolution came unexpectedly. In 1047, during a joint campaign against Denmark, the young King Magnus suddenly fell ill and died on his ship. According to one version, he died of an illness, according to another as a result of an accident falling from his horse. Dying, he allegedly divided his inheritance. He bequeathed the Danish throne to his enemy Svein Estridsson, saying it would be just, and the Norwegian one to his uncle and co-ruler Harald. Harald, of course, did not agree with such a will. He considered himself the legitimate heir to Magnus's entire empire. He was already preparing to continue the campaign against Denmark, but the Norwegian nobility convinced him that the first priority was to bring his nephew's body back to his homeland and bury him with honor next to his father, Olaf the Saint, in Trondheim. Harald reluctantly heeded this advice. He buried Magnus in Nidaros Cathedral and convened a Thing, where he was unanimously proclaimed king of all Norway. From this moment began the era of the sole rule of Harald III Sigurdsson, to whom history would give the nickname Hardrada, the hard ruler, and he immediately set about proving that he deserved this nickname. The crown of Norway rested on Harald's head, but it brought him no peace. For him, power was not an end in itself, but an instrument for further achievements. His reign became an era of iron and blood for Norway. The country was to be forged anew in his own image, strong, united, and ruthless. And the first to feel the full weight of his iron hand was his former ally and eternal rival, King Svein of Denmark. Having become the sole king of Norway, Harald immediately unleashed the full force of his unbending character on the country and its neighbors. The period of his reign, from 1047 to 1066, was a time of continuous wars, brutal suppression of dissent, and large-scale state transformations. His first and main target was Denmark. Harald did not recognize Svein Estridsson's rights to the Danish throne and began a long and grueling war against him, which lasted for almost 2 decades. This was not a war of major field battles. Harald's tactic was typical of Vikings at their most brutal. Every year, with the coming of summer, his fleet would conduct devastating raids on the Danish coast. This war was fought by the Leidangre, the so-called general naval levy, which Harald summoned with merciless regularity. Every summer, thousands of free bondir were forced to leave their fields and families, equip their ships, and set out on a risky campaign that for many became their last. This exhausted not only Denmark but also Norway itself, causing muted discontent among the peasants who bore the full brunt of the king's ambitions. The purpose of these raids was to exhaust Denmark, to undermine its economy and the authority of King Svein. In 1050, Harald dealt a particularly painful blow, plundering and burning to the ground Hedeby, the largest and richest commercial center of Denmark and all of northern Europe. After this blow, Hedeby never recovered and soon ceased to exist. This war was incredibly brutal. Harald knew no mercy, and his name struck terror into the inhabitants of the Danish islands. Svein Estridsson, in turn, was a stubborn and skilled opponent. He rebuilt what was destroyed, assembled a new fleet, and periodically launched counter-strikes. The culmination of this long-standing confrontation was the grand naval battle at the river Nisan, or Niso, as it is called in Denmark, off the coast of Holland on August 9th, 1062. Harald assembled a huge fleet of 150 ships and decided to give a general battle. Sweyn accepted the challenge, fielding, according to the sagas, a fleet twice as large, that is, 300 ships. The battle began in the evening and, according to saga descriptions, lasted all night. The ships were locked together and the fight turned into a bloody slaughter on the decks by moonlight. In the end, Harald, thanks to his tactical genius and the ferocity of his warriors, won a complete victory. The Danish fleet was almost completely destroyed, 70 ships were captured, and Sweyn himself barely escaped by fleeing, disguised as a common peasant. Harald acted no less harshly within Norway itself. He sought to create a strong, centralized state on the Byzantine model, and for this, it was necessary to break the resistance of the powerful clan nobility. Any attempts at disobedience or separatism were suppressed with merciless cruelty. The Jarls of Uppland offered particularly stubborn resistance. Harald went through their lands with fire and sword, executing rebellious chieftains and confiscating their domains. He did not even spare those who had once helped him come to power. Thus, the powerful aristocrat Finn Arneson, who had been his ally, was forced to flee to Denmark after Harald treacherously killed his brother Kalfur. This episode became a chilling signal to all Norwegian nobility. In Harald's world, there was no statute of limitations for betrayal of his kin, and no subsequent merits could atone for old sins. The aristocracy lived in constant tension, understanding that the king's wrath could fall on anyone. Every chieftain faced a choice: submit and serve, risking one day falling out of favor, or flee like Finn Arneson, losing lands and status. Almost no one dared to contemplate a third option: open resistance. His methods were a direct reflection of what he had seen in Constantinople. There he had learned that the emperor's power was absolute and brooked no challenge. Returning to Norway, he tried to transplant this model to Scandinavian soil, where the traditions of the Thing and the liberties of the nobility were stronger than anywhere else. He unhesitatingly used the confiscation of lands and wealth of the disobedient as a tool of political and economic pressure, replenishing his treasury and weakening his opponents. This policy, which earned the name harsh rule or hardstjorn, caused constant grumbling. But the king's power, based on his personal warband and enormous fortune, prevented open discontent from turning into a rebellion. He established strict control over the church, appointing bishops without regard for the authority of the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, which had traditionally considered Scandinavia its canonical territory. For Harald, the church was another instrument of state administration, not an independent force. But it would be a mistake to see Harald as merely a ruthless tyrant. This man, hardened in battles and intrigues, was also one of the most famous skalds of his time. He wielded the word as skillfully as the axe. The Gamanvisur, or Verses of Joy, a cycle of 16 stanzas dedicated to Elisiv of Kiev, are attributed to him, which he allegedly composed while waiting for her hand. In them, he lists his 8 skills from swimming and skiing to brewing and playing the harp, but laments that the Rus's maiden in golden attire still scorns me. This touch reveals in him not only a warrior but also a man capable of deep feelings and reflection, making his figure even more complex and contradictory. However, his rule was not limited to wars and repressions. Harald was also a far-sighted ruler. He understood the importance of trade for the prosperity of the state. Around 1048, he founded a trading town in a convenient bay in the south of the country, which he named Oslo. This city was destined to become the capital of Norway in the future. The founding of Oslo was not just a whim, but a strategic move. The city was located deep in a well-protected fjord, controlling important trade routes of eastern Norway. It was his personal project, a royal city which, unlike ancient centers like Trondheim, was not associated with powerful aristocratic clans. The introduction of a unified currency minted from his Byzantine and Kievan silver was a true economic revolution. The coins bearing his profile and the title Harald Rex Nor, that is, Harald, King of Norway, not only standardized trade but were also a most powerful propaganda tool, daily reminding every inhabitant of the country who its sole and undisputed ruler was. He stimulated trade by providing merchants with protection and creating markets, understanding that a prosperous economy is the foundation of a strong army and a full treasury. Lessons also learned in the bustling markets of Miklagard. Also under him, Christianity was finally established as the state religion, and new churches were built, although Harald himself apparently retained the mentality and values of a Viking until the end of his life. To strengthen his position within the country, in addition to his marriage to Elisiv of Kyiv, he took as his wife Thora Thorbergsdottir, a representative of one of the most powerful Norwegian clans. This polygamous union, unthinkable for Christian monarchs in Europe, was quite in the spirit of old Scandinavian traditions and served purely political purposes. Finally, in 1064, after almost 20 years of bloodshed that had exhausted both kingdoms, Harald was forced to make peace with Sweyn. Under the terms of the treaty, both kings recognized each other as rulers of their countries within the existing borders. The 20-year war had ended, in essence, in a draw. By 1065, Harald the Hard Ruler was at the peak of his power. He was about 50, an advanced age for a warrior of that era. It seemed he could have stopped, but for a nature like Harald's, peace was tantamount to death. This war, which had not brought him the Danish crown, had nevertheless accomplished another task. It had kept his army in constant readiness and the discontented nobility occupied with an external enemy. Perhaps by ending one conflict, Harald, with his boundless energy, was already looking for a new, more grandiose target for his war machine. On the horizon, a new goal loomed, more tempting than Denmark, the crown of England. 1066, the stars over Europe were aligned in a fateful pattern. A sinister guest appeared in the heavens, a comet that would later be called Halley's Comet. For medieval people, this was an undeniable sign of great changes to come, of wars and the fall of kingdoms. In England, on one of the richest thrones in the Christian world, a childless king died, leaving behind a power vacuum that, like a vortex, began to draw in the most ambitious predators of the continent. From the south, from Normandy, Duke William was already looking at England, assembling an invasion armada. And in the north, in the cold fjords of Norway, the aging Viking king Harald Hardrada heard the call of destiny. A tempter appeared before him, the exiled brother of the new English king, promising an easy victory. For Harald, this was the last chance to inscribe his name in history in golden letters and to create a great northern empire. The stakes were at their maximum, all or nothing. On January 5th, 1066, the childless king of England, Edward the Confessor, died. With his death, the ancient Wessex dynasty came to an end, and the English throne became vacant. The struggle for the English succession immediately became the main political intrigue on the continent. 3 men laid claim to the throne. Firstly, Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English earl, head of the richest house in England. He was elected king by the Council of Nobles, the Witenagemot, and crowned the very next day after Edward's death. His right was based on the will of the English aristocracy and his real power in the country. Secondly, William, Duke of Normandy, a distant relative of Edward. He claimed that Edward had promised him the throne during his lifetime and that Harold Godwinson himself, having fallen into his hands as a captive a few years earlier, had sworn on holy relics to support his claim. For William, it was a matter not only of power but also of violated honor. And finally, thirdly, Harald Hardrada. His claims were based on a shaky treaty concluded between his predecessor Magnus the Good and the King of England Harthacnut, but that was enough. The catalyst that turned vague claims into a real invasion plan was the appearance at Harold's court of Tostig Godwinson, the brother of the new English king, Harold. Exiled and thirsting for revenge, Tostig was a master of persuasion. He painted a rosy picture of an easy victory before Harold, assuring him that England was divided and that Harold Godwinson was weak and unloved. "The north of England," he said, "is the former Danelaw. Our people live there. They will greet you as a liberator from the southern tyranny of the House of Godwin." The thirst for glory and booty, the boredom of a peaceful life, and the prospect of becoming the ruler of a great northern empire clouded the 50-year-old king's mind. The sagas say that even bad omens did not stop him. One of his men had a dream in which he saw the fleet approaching England. But on the shore it was met not by an army but by a pack of wolves and ravens craving carrion. Harold himself, according to tradition, composed a final visa before sailing. Full of grim determination, he had made his fateful decision. Throughout the spring and summer of 1066, all of Norway buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Ships were being built and equipped in the shipyards. Warriors flocked to assembly points from all the fjords. Harald assembled a colossal fleet for the time, by various estimates from 200 to 300 ships, and an army of up to 15,000 warriors. It was a huge force comprising the flower of Norwegian soldiery. Before sailing, Harald proclaimed his son Magnus as regent king, and took his other son Olaf, his wife Elisiv, and his daughters with him on the campaign. In early September 1066, the Norwegian armada left the shores of Norway. Joining with Tostig's ships, the fleet entered the mouth of the Humber River. The last great Viking expedition had begun. King Harold Godwinson, with the main army, was in the south, awaiting William's invasion. The north was defenseless. On September 20th, 1066, at the village of Fulford, south of York, the armies of the northern English earls, Edwin and Morcar, were utterly routed. The victory opened the way to York for Harald. The city capitulated. It seemed that Tostig's calculations had been fully justified. Intoxicated by success, Harold encamped his army near a place called Stamford Bridge to await the arrival of hostages. He had no idea that at that very moment, making an unprecedented forced march in history, King Harold Godwinson's army was rushing towards him from the south at full speed. The sun shone deceptively gently, its rays playing on the surface of the river Derwent. In the Norwegian camp, the carefree atmosphere of victors reigned. The warriors rested, cleaned their weapons, and dreamed of rich English booty. They already saw themselves as masters of this land. But fate, or as they would have said, the Norns who spin the threads of life, had already woven a different pattern for them. A cloud of dust was rising on the road from York, and in that cloud, doom was hidden. Doom in the form of an enraged English king and his elite housecarl warriors, thirsting for revenge. The morning of September 25th, 1066 was unusually warm. A relaxed atmosphere prevailed in the Norwegian camp at Stamford Bridge. Confident that there was no threat, they had left about a third of their forces and, fatally, most of their armor, heavy chainmail and helmets, on the ships, which were 20 kilometers away from the camp. Suddenly, a huge cloud of dust appeared in the west, and then from it, glittering in the morning sun with thousands of helmets and spearheads, a huge army emerged. It was King Harold Godwinson. Learning of the invasion, he had done the almost impossible, covering more than 300 kilometers in just 4 days. His army, consisting of elite housecarls and the feared militia, was exhausted but full of determination. Upon reaching York, he immediately led his warriors into battle to catch the enemy by surprise. For the Norwegians, this was a complete shock. Harald Hardrada instantly assessed the danger. He sent messengers to the ships with orders to come to their aid immediately. While he began to form up his troops on the east bank of the river, using the narrow wooden bridge as a key defensive point. And here, on this bridge, one of the most legendary scenes in history unfolded. The English charged the bridge wave after wave, but a handful of Norwegians fought back desperately. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, at one point only a single warrior, an unnamed Norwegian berserker of giant stature, remained on the bridge. Wielding his huge two-handed axe, he single-handedly held the entire passage, slaying, according to tradition, 40 Englishmen. Only a ruse could overcome him. Several soldiers floated under the bridge in a boat and speared the giant from below. The way was clear. The English army poured across the bridge. The main phase of the battle began. The Norwegians formed in a shield wall, defended desperately. Harald Hardrada, fighting in the front ranks without his mail coat, having fallen, as the sagas say, into a berserker rage wielding a two-handed sword, was recognizable from afar. Before the battle, according to the sagas, a famous dialogue took place. Harold Godwinson offered Tostig a pardon. Tostig asked what the King of England offered his ally, Harold. The answer was stern. 7 feet of English ground, or a little more, as he is taller than other men. In the heat of battle, a stray arrow struck Harold directly in the throat. The last great Viking collapsed to the ground. The leader's death decided the outcome of the battle. The Norwegians wavered. The reinforcements that had rushed from the ships, exhausted from the run, could not turn the tide of the battle and only joined their comrades in a final, desperate struggle. The rout was complete. Of the nearly 300 ships, only 25 were needed to carry the remnants of the army back. The death of Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, was not just the death of one king. This event became a symbolic endpoint, concluding an entire historical era, the 300-year Viking Age. The last grand attempt at Scandinavian conquest was fading into the past, giving way to feudal monarchies. Harold's body was handed over to his son Olaf, whom the victor, Harald Godwinson, magnanimously allowed to sail home. Later, the remains of the last Viking king were reburied in Norway. Harald Godwinson's victory was brilliant but Pyrrhic. His army had suffered heavy losses and was exhausted, and just 3 days after the battle, on the southern coast of England at Pevensey, William of Normandy's army landed. Harold had to make another forced march, this time to the south. On October 14th, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, the weakened English army was defeated, and King Harold himself was killed. Thus Harold's invasion, though it failed, played a fateful role in England's destiny, fatally weakening its defense and, in essence, opening the way for the Norman conquest. The legacy of Harald Hardrada is multifaceted. In the memory of posterity, he remained as the model of an indomitable Viking, a warrior, commander, poet, adventurer, and ruthless ruler. His life, described in the sagas, reads like an exciting novel. For Norway, he was a harsh but effective ruler who, by force, strengthened royal authority, founded the future capital, and laid the foundations of a unified state. In a broader context, Harald Hardrada is the last prominent representative of a departing world. He was a man of a transitional era, combining the qualities of a pagan hero and a Christian monarch. He lived his life on the edge of a sword and died as he had lived in battle. And with his last breath on the field at Stamford Bridge, the era of the Drakkar ships finally became a matter of history, turning into a legend. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please subscribe to our channel. Leave your comments and share your thoughts on this outstanding figure. Until new meetings.